Mr. Finkelstein was a regular sort of fellow. There was nothing too fancy about him. He had a fine job that paid enough to support his family. There wasn't any fancy position with a complicated sounding title. Most people generally liked him. However, there was one person who didn't seem to care too much for him. That was Mrs. Finkelstein's mother, his mother in law. No matter what he did, he never seemed to impress her. At family gatherings, she would criticize him endlessly. She would criticize his job. She would criticize his clothes. She would criticize the way he cut his steak into pieces before he ate it. One day, Mrs. Finkelstein decided that that she had. One day, Mrs. Finkelstein decided that she had had enough of the constant criticism that her poor husband had to endure. She said to him, "Honey, I'll be out of town a few days. I'm going to make a kugel for my mother, and I want you to take it to her. It's her favorite recipe, and maybe if you are the one who brings it to her, she'll start to warm up to you a little bit. I mean, it won't change her attitude overnight or anything, but it may just help things between the two of you a little bit." So she made the kugel and left it in the fridge where Mr. Finkelstein would take it with him in the morning. Well, the next morning was one of those really difficult mornings. The coffee machine got blocked and spilled all over the floor. His daughter forgot that she was supposed to bring snacks to class that day, and his son had taken the shoelaces out of all of his shoes. Well, he was running around so much that, wouldn't you know it, he completely forgot the kugel. Well, he thought to himself, it will get a little bit dried out in the fridge all day, but it'll still be good. I'll take it to my mother-in-law tomorrow. Well, the next day he got the kids to school with no problem, but then he got a flat tire on the way into work. He had to get out and change the spare, but couldn't find the tire iron anywhere. He had to sit out in the hot morning sun with the kugel in the back of the car for an hour, waiting for someone to stop and help him. He finally got to work, but he knew that he would have to stay late to finish up all the work for the day. There was a big deadline coming up after all. Well, by the time he left, he was too tired to think about anything other than getting home and putting the kids to bed. So he drove home without stopping at his mother-in-law's. The next morning was Saturday, and he woke up suddenly remembering the kugel. He had left it in the car. He leaped out of bed and jumped into the car to drive it to her house. The rain was pouring that morning, and the whole way he had his wipers turned all the way up. He got out of the car and grabbed the kugel. The pouring rain soaked right through the tin foil that was covering it, as well as all of his clothes. But he would not be deterred. He rang the doorbell, and after a moment, standing there in the open doorway was his mother-in-law. "I brought you this kugel," he said, and explained the whole story once she invited him in. He hoped that she would see all the effort that he put into bringing this kugel to her, and that she might take pity. Well, she reached out and took the pan of kugel from his hands. She took one look at the shriveled, soggy mess in front of her, walked into the kitchen, and dumped it into the garbage. Unfortunately, this was not going to be the day that Mr. Finkelstein finally impressed his mother-in-law. He went home, shoes soggy from the rain and shoulders slumped in defeat. Maybe he would have another chance on another day to finally make a good impression, but this was just not his day. Well, what can we learn from the story of Mr. Finkelstein? In this week's Torah portion, we have a lot of commandments. Most of them especially in the later half of this week's portion, are moral laws that are intended to guide us in living holy lives. In fact, this week we have a double Torah portion, Acharei Mot and Kidoshim. The name Kidoshim literally means holiness. We are told by God, "You shall be holy, for I, Adonai, am holy." The Torah portion includes things like honoring our parents, engaging in honest business practices, giving to the poor, and loving our neighbors. Yet in the middle of all these moral commandments is the following passage. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to Adonai, you shall offer it so that it may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it or the day after, and anything left over until the third day should be burned up with fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is tainted. It will not be accepted. Well, in modern practice, we don't try to please God with sacrifices, but by giving our time and effort to performing holy acts. We call these mitzvahs. The Torah tells us how to do these mitzvahs, but this passage seems to beg the question, can a mitzvah go bad? Sometimes we set out to do something nice for another person. It may be making a phone call or visiting, talking to a parent, or dropping off canned goods at the food bank, or buying a nice gift for someone that we care about. Yes, we set out to do. Sometimes we set out to do these things, but life just seems to get in the way. We end up walking right by the mitzvah in our rush to deal with life. We set out with the best intentions, but one day turns into two or three. One urgent thing after another comes up, and we forget what we set out to do in the first place. There never seems to be enough time in life for the things that matter the most. We sometimes find ourselves so caught up in all of the little urgent things that we neglect to do the things that are big and important. If you're like me, then there's at least one thing that comes to your mind as I'm talking. There's at least one good mitzvah that you've been thinking about doing that you just haven't gotten around to. Well, that's okay. It happens to just about everyone. But this Shabbat is just starting. You have from now until sundown tomorrow to make this a special Shabbat and complete that mitzvah, whatever it is that you've been planning and intending to do for a while now. Shabbat is an excellent day to do something, especially for God, and to make the world around you just a little bit nicer, kinder, more just, and generous. It is an excellent day to be a little bit more holy. What will you do? Whatever it is, don't wait until tomorrow. Don't let the sun set on another chance to do a mitzvah. It is always good to do a mitzvah, but running to do a good deed is a mitzvah in itself. Don't let the kugel go bad. Don't let the peace offering to Adonai go to waste. Don't let a good mitzvah turn bad. Shabbat Shalom.